interested, and I know many of us on the board, we're interested in some of your observations about the need for a long-term approach to tuition policy in Wisconsin. And I just wondered if you might offer a comment or two as you see sort of the key 2 or 3 issues that ought to be a focus both of this board and of this university and of the state of Wisconsin over the coming year or two as we go through a period, obviously, of a tuition freeze, but look longer term to the question of tuition policy.
The first reaction was we're 15% overstaffed in terms of the resources we had. And we one of the things we did was just not hire people or replace retirements. So there's a revenue crisis. And the way you focus on that, there are really 3 issues. One of them is cost containment. The other one is technology and innovation, increased capacity and efficiency. And thirdly, make sure your price makes sense in relation to your competitors. The first 2, I think, can be done, and you could view them as self-help without, in a sense, just waiting around for another cash layout from the state. But if your price is $5,000 less than most of your competitors, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, then you're trapped by using up all your innovation to just simply catch up with other people's price. So at some point, we have to decide how does the price fit in relation to the broader calculus of the cost of higher education in relation to other states with similar costs. And then, of course, if you could recalibrate, you can have low tuition increases. Our problem is that most of our increases are catch-up. I mean, even with the reciprocity with Minnesota, it's unimaginably complicated to have them charging in-state tuition at, was it $4,000 or something like that greater than we are. I mean, so at some point, we have to look at the Midwest. We have to look at the in-state, out-of-state balance and come to some conclusions that if you're going to have incentives for our campuses to do cost containment and innovate, they can't do that from a price that's dead last. And they certainly can't pay their faculty adequately and competitively if that's the case. So instead of looking at percentage increases on a base that's unrealistically set, it would be good for us to decide what is a fair price and then guarantee going forward very prudent increases in tuition. But to, in fact, have freezes on tuition levels that in relation to our competitors, are unrealistically non-competitive is a race to the bottom, as I've said several times. I understand this year, because of the balances, it made a great deal of sense to tactically retreat and say that money should help the parent and the student pay their tuition this year. But going forward, that's one-time money. It will not resolve the structural dilemma of the tuition level of this system. So again, I think campuses will do cost containment, we will innovate, but if we're doing that in relation to a price which is unrealistically set in relation to our competitors, I don't know how we in effect compete effectively. So that's why we need a tuition policy. What is a fair and reasonable tuition policy as you look more broadly at the Big Ten or the competitors of our ASCII schools? The other issue is giving the public a better sense of the public versus the private responsibility for tuition. I came in 1960, paid 5% of my tuition, 95% came from the state. My granddaughter arrives in Madison in September. Her parents, and a little contribution from me, will pay 55%, and 45% will come from the state. That you could call demographic injustice. That is, today, my grandchildren are getting less of a public subsidy than I did. But that's natural, because obviously costs are different, the number of people who are middle class is different, and it's a completely different concept. It's now a shared responsibility to have public and private contributions to higher ed. When I came, it was seen as a public utility, almost a pure public utility. It's no longer an entitlement, but many middle-class folks, because they're stressed by the increase in tuition and don't understand why it is necessary, feel very angry about that and still see it as an entitlement. So there's been no explanation. My best way of explaining this is there's been no policy discussion about that. It's happened by water torture since about 1990. Just little bits and pieces of drops in state support, increases in tuition, but not rationally related. And I'll end by saying, in the country for which I once came, but which doesn't quite know whether I belong anymore because I'm hyper-American, as you know, when you look at the British parliamentary decision on undergraduate tuition in England in 2008, made by a left of centre government, they suddenly realized they could not afford to pay higher education costs as a pure public utility, 100% paid by the state. They had to decide what was the ratio of the family contribution and the state contribution, 45, 55, 25, 75, or 50-50. They came up with a cost of higher education that was somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000, depending on the quality of the institution and so on, of place in the country. Came to the conclusion it should be 50-50, about $9,000 to the family, £5,000, $9,000, towards the $18,000 estimated cost that came from the exchequer for an undergraduate education. They voted on that, and they came up with a figure of $9,000. The year before, it was zero. They went to $9,000 with the left-leaning government, that the private contribution would now be 50% of the cost of college. Everybody knew what the debate was about. Everybody knew it was $18,000 was the cost of it, on the average, of a British undergraduate education, and that the fair way now was no longer an entitlement. It was a balanced commitment from the family that should start saving, or maybe take loans, or get grants if they're low income, and the rest would come from the state. This was a very rational public policy decision made in 1 year with a vote. More votes coming from conservatives than from the Labour Party, who actually proposed it. We've never had that debate. We don't know where we are. We don't know what the cost of education is, nor do we know what the proportion should be. So we have these random sort of issues that come up every so often, where usually a crisis defines what you do, not some systemic policy discussion. I hope that kind of helps a bit.
I thought that was pretty good. Thank you, President.
Couldn't have said it better yourself. Other questions? Good. Yeah.